A wealthy man mistreats a cart horse, but repents when the animal reveals an ancestral secret. Destinies intertwined in a story of humility and redemption that will transform their lives. The horse, wiser than his aggressor, offers a lesson in respect that no one will forget, an emotional journey of transformation that will touch your heart. Subscribe, like, and comment on where you are watching this video from. The sun rose lazily over Harmony Creek, painting the cobblestone streets that snaked between colorful houses in gold. It was one of those places time seemed to have forgotten, where the aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the scent of damp earth, and the sound of horses' hooves marked the rhythm of the mornings. The clock in the town's main church had just struck 6 when Jerry, as everyone knew him, was already leading his old cart through the narrow streets. Beside him, Thunder, a dappled horse with a brown coat and white patches, moved with measured steps, knowing every corner, every customer, every stop by heart. On that special spring morning, the town was bustling more than usual. The traditional harvest festival would begin in a few hours, and families were preparing to celebrate another year of abundance in the fields surrounding the municipality. Jerry and Thunder followed their daily delivery routine, taking fresh vegetables, milk, and eggs to the homes that depended on this simple but essential service. "Come on, old boy," Jerry whispered, stroking the animal's mane as they stopped, in front of Manny's bakery. "Today, work finishes early. We deserve a little celebration too, don't we?" Thunder responded with a soft whinny, as if understanding every word. The connection between them transcended the simple relationship between man and working animal. They were companions on a journey, dependent on each other in a perfect symbiosis built over 12 years. Together, they had faced droughts, floods, financial difficulties, and the inevitable changes that even a small town like Harmony Creek occasionally underwent. The tranquility of that morning, however, was abruptly interrupted by the aggressive roar of a powerful engine. A black SUV with tinted windows, as out of place in that setting as a fish in the desert, advanced impatiently down the narrow street, honking insistently behind Jerry's cart. The vehicle seemed to want to swallow the space, imposing its metallic presence on the peaceful rhythm of the small town. Jerry signaled that he would move aside as soon as possible, but the narrow street did not offer much room for maneuver. Thunder, sensing the sudden agitation, moved nervously, unintentionally blocking the passage even more. It was then that the SUV door opened violently, and a man in an expensive suit and urban appearance emerged, his face contorted into a mask of irritation. "What the hell do you think you're doing? Get that antique cart out of my way," the stranger bellowed, gesturing dramatically with well-manicured hands that had never known hard work. "Just a moment, young man. We're moving right away," Jerry replied with the calmness of those who know the value of patience. "Thunder, come on, my friend." The man, however, was not willing to wait. With determined steps, he approached the cart, and in a gesture that froze the hearts of everyone present that festive morning, violently struck Thunder's flank with his Italian leather briefcase. The dry crack of the impact echoed through the street like a gunshot, followed by the animal's startled and pained whinny. "Get out of the way, you stupid beast," he shouted, delivering a second blow while the few pedestrians watched in horror. Thunder reared up, startled and confused, almost overturning the cart. Jerry, with surprising agility for his 72 years, firmly held the reins, calming the animal with gentle words. His eyes, however, burned with an indignation rarely seen in that man of serene temperament. "You can't do that," intervened a young woman who watched the scene from the sidewalk. "This animal did nothing to you." The aggressor adjusted his expensive jacket, indifferent to the small drama he had created. His gaze swept over the street as if assessing land for purchase, without truly connecting with any of the faces that stared at him with disapproval. "You people don't understand, do you? Time is money, and people like me can't be waiting for this." He gestured towards the cart with disdain. "This place urgently needs to enter the 21st century." He returned to his luxurious vehicle and, as soon as Jerry managed to guide Thunder to the side, accelerated abruptly, leaving behind a cloud of dust and indignation. What no one noticed at that moment was the look Thunder cast at the departing vehicle. a look almost human in its intensity, as if engraving in his memory not only the offense, but the offender. The incident quickly spread through small Harmony Creek, running from mouth to mouth until it reached the Harvest Festival preparations in the central square. It was that businessman from the city, it was said, the one who bought Hilltop Farm to build I don't know what. The information was vague, but the feeling was clear. A stranger had arrived, disrespecting not only one of the town's most beloved residents, but also the values that sustained that community. Robert Smith, the man from the SUV, couldn't have been less concerned about the impression he had made. Staying in the old manor house of Hilltop Farm, a property he had acquired for a fraction of its real value thanks to questionable legal maneuvers, he surveyed the horizon with the satisfaction of someone who sees opportunities where others see only landscape. "This place is a diamond in the rough," he commented to his assistant as they examined plans and projects spread out on a makeshift table. "I bought it for almost nothing, and in 2 years, we'll transform this backwater into a tourist and residential complex that will triple my investment." Rick, his assistant and lawyer, nodded automatically. Accustomed to his boss's volatile temperament, he knew that disagreements were rarely welcome. "The projects are ready, and the preliminary environmental permits are approved. We just need to finalize some issues with the local town hall," he informed, consulting his tablet. "There is, however, a small complication with a part of the land where we intend to build the shopping center. Apparently, there are some local stories about the area being—" "Don't come to me with local stories," Robert interrupted impatiently. "I legally bought this property and have all the necessary documents. If some hick thinks he's going to disrupt my plans with legends or superstitions, he's sorely mistaken." What Robert Smith didn't know, while disdainfully dismissing local traditions with arrogance, was that some places hold stories deeper than any deed, and that certain connections, like the one that united Jerry and Thunder, possessed roots that reached dimensions that men like him, obsessed with quick profit, would never comprehend. In the weeks that followed, while the effects of the Harvest Festival incident slowly faded into the town's routine, something strange began to happen. Thunder, always docile and predictable in his roots, began to exhibit inexplicable behavior. Every time Jerry tried to pass by the road that bordered Hilltop Farm, a necessary path to deliver products to the more distant small farms, the animal simply refused to proceed. At first, Jerry attributed the behavior to the trauma suffered. "He must be associating the place with that terrible man," he explained to his daughter Mary, who had come from the city to visit him after hearing about the incident. Animals have memories for these things. However, the situation worsened as the days passed. Thunder not only refused to pass by the place, he showed unusual agitation, whinnying desperately, rearing up, and even breaking into a cold sweat when forced to approach that specific property. For an animal normally so calm, this was completely atypical. "Dad, this isn't normal," Mary insisted after witnessing one of these episodes. "Maybe we should consult Dr. Miller." Dr. Paul Miller was the local veterinarian, trained in the city, but born and raised in Harmony Creek. He knew every animal in the region, and had treated Thunder since he was just a foal. After a thorough examination, his conclusion was disconcerting. "Physically, he's perfectly healthy. I see no medical reason for this behavior." "What about the trauma from the incident?" Jerry questioned, worried. The veterinarian scratched his chin thoughtfully. "It could explain part of the reaction, but not in such a specific and intense way. It's almost as if he hesitated, aware of the weight of his next words, trying to warn us about something. The suggestion hung in the air of the small veterinary clinic like an invisible presence. In small towns like Harmony Creek, where the line between the rational and the mystical often blurred, stories about animals that sensed disasters or perceived things beyond human comprehension were not uncommon. Meanwhile, at Hilltop Farm, preliminary works had begun. Tractors and excavators tore into the red soil, preparing the land for the foundations of Robert Smith's ambitious project. The businessman personally supervised each step, eager to accelerate a process that, in his view, was already behind schedule. "We need to finish this phase before the summer rains," he ordered the engineer in charge, ignoring recommendations for more in-depth soil studies. Every day stopped is money wasted. It was on one of these visits, when Robert was inspecting the progress in the western sector of the property, that the first truly strange incident occurred. The sky, until then perfectly clear, suddenly darkened. A storm that seemed to come out of nowhere broke over the area with unusual fury, forcing work to stop. The most peculiar thing, however, was that the rain seemed to be concentrated exclusively over Hilltop Farm, as if an invisible hand had opened a celestial tap precisely over that perimeter. The force of the water that fell in a few hours was enough to create small landslides, one of which knocked down part of the manor house wall, where Robert had set up his temporary office. Among the rubble, wrapped in waxed fabric as if deliberately hidden, were papers yellowed by time, old property records, maps with incomprehensible markings, and letters written in delicate handwriting dating back to the 19th century. Robert, pragmatic as always, barely paid attention to the papers. Probably worthless historical junk, he commented, ordering them to be stored somewhere. Rick, however, more sensitive to the implications of that discovery, secretly decided to examine the documents more carefully. Coincidentally, or perhaps it was no coincidence at all, it was in this same week that Thunder further intensified his erratic behavior. Now, in addition to refusing to pass by the property, the animal began to show an unusual interest in a specific point near the fence that delimited the area where the shopping center foundations would be built. On 3 separate occasions, when Jerry allowed the horse to graze freely nearby, Thunder went exactly to the same spot and began to dig at the soil with his front hooves, a behavior never observed before. This curious fact did not go unnoticed by the local residents, especially after Jerry himself mentioned the case during a meeting of the Association of Small Rural Producers. "That animal knows something we don't," commented Grandma Mildred, an 80-year-old lady whom everyone respected for her wisdom. "My grandfather always said that horses see what human eyes cannot." The mystical comment would have been just another local folklore story if it weren't for what happened next. Robert Smith, facing growing criticism from the community and concerned about the delays caused by ridiculous superstitions, as he himself defined them, decided it was time to remove what he considered the main obstacle to his plans: the antique cart that daily reminded residents of the Harvest Festival incident. One Wednesday afternoon, he parked his SUV in front of Jerry's modest house. The contrast between the luxurious vehicle and the simple residence with peeling walls could not have been greater, a microcosm of the very disparity that his presence represented in that community. "I came to make a proposal that will benefit us all," he announced as soon as Jerry received him in the small yard, where some chickens scratched freely. Without waiting for an invitation, he sat on a worn wooden bench under the shade of a centuries-old mango tree. "I'm willing to buy your horse and cart for 20 times their market value." Jerry, who until then had maintained a neutral expression, furrowed his brow in confusion. "Buy Thunder? But why?" Robert smiled with that condescension typical of those who consider themselves superior. "To modernize your work, of course. With the money I'm offering, you can buy a used pickup truck in good condition. It will be more efficient, faster, and frankly more dignified for a man of your age." The old cart driver remained silent for a few moments, observing the calloused hands that rested in his lap. When he finally looked up, there was a surprising firmness in his gaze. "I appreciate your concern, Doctor, but Thunder is not for sale, not for that price, nor for any price." Robert, unaccustomed to refusals, impulsively increased the offer. "I'll double the value then. It's a unique opportunity." "You don't understand," Jerry replied with quiet dignity. "Thunder is not a tool that I can replace. He is." He hesitated, searching for words to express a feeling too deep to be easily translated. "He is family, and family is priceless." The businessman left the property visibly irritated, but his offer, and Jerry's refusal, quickly became known throughout Harmony Creek. What Robert intended to be a private transaction transformed into a public symbol. Money versus traditional values, imposed progress versus resistance rooted in connections deeper than any purely economic logic could justify. The silent clash between the businessman and the cart driver gained a new dimension when an unexpected visitor arrived in town. Helena Davis, an archaeologist from the State University, had been drawn by rumors about possible historical remains in the region. Initially skeptical, her professional curiosity was immediately piqued when a local resident mentioned the strange behavior of the horse that insisted on digging always in the same place. Animals often detect changes in the soil or chemical composition that our senses don't pick up, she explained to the small audience gathered at the town square cafe. It wouldn't be the first time that important archaeological discoveries are made thanks to the unusual behavior of animals. With the reluctant permission of Robert Smith, obtained only after mentioning possible legal implications if he prevented a preliminary investigation, and accompanied by Jerry and Thunder, Helena visited the place that so intrigued the animal. Equipped with non-invasive detection instruments, the archaeologist carried out preliminary tests that revealed something surprising. There were undoubtedly artificial structures buried approximately 6 feet below the surface. We need controlled excavations to confirm, but the data suggests the presence of old foundations, she informed, barely containing her professional excitement. Based on the configuration and location, my initial hypothesis is that we may be facing a settlement of freed slaves. The words fell like a bombshell on the community. Settlements of freed slaves, settlements founded by escaped slaves during the colonial period, were more than just archaeological sites. They represented a fundamental chapter of Black resistance, symbols of the struggle for freedom and human dignity. For many local families, especially those of African American descent like Jerry's, the possibility of discovering a settlement of freed slaves on their ancestral lands represented a reconnection with roots long obscured by official history. It was not just a scientific find, it was the recovery of a collective identity. Robert Smith, however, saw the situation through a completely different lens. The archaeological discovery represented delays, bureaucratic complications, and potentially the need to redesign his entire project. In a tense meeting with his lawyers, his frustration was palpable. This is ridiculous. A bunch of ruins without proven historical value is going to stop a multi-million-dollar investment that would bring real progress to this forgotten town? His lawyers, more cautious, explained the complexity of the situation. If it's confirmed as a settlement of freed slaves, the site could be declared a historical and cultural heritage site. There are specific laws protecting these sites. Laws were made to be circumvented, Robert retorted with a cold smile. Activate our contacts in the State Department of Culture. We need any preservation process to be slowed down. While the businessman mobilized his arsenal of political and economic influence, something unexpected happened in the community of Harmony Creek. The possible archaeological discovery had awakened an unprecedented interest in local history. Old residents began to share stories passed down through generations about ancestors who had found refuge in the mountains of the region during the slavery period. In one of these conversation circles, now held almost daily in the central square, Grandma Mildred surprised everyone with a revelation. My great-grandmother said there was a map of the settlement and a grotto where they kept sacred objects brought from Africa. The map was divided into several parts and distributed among the founding families to protect the secret. Helena, the archaeologist, immediately made the connection with the documents found after the landslide in the manor house wall. Could it be that those papers? The answer came through Rick, Robert's assistant, who had secretly examined the old documents. Moved by a growing ethical unease about his boss's methods, he decided to share his findings with Helena and a small group of interested residents. Among the papers found there are indeed fragments of what appears to be a map, he confirmed, showing photographs he had discreetly taken. And more, there are correspondences that explicitly mention an agreement to conceal the existence of the settlement of freed slaves during the final period of slavery. The tension in the town reached a critical point when the State Department of Culture announced a public hearing to discuss the future of the archaeological site and the real estate project. The event, scheduled to take place in the municipal school gymnasium, attracted practically the entire population of Harmony Creek, as well as representatives of the regional press and activists from African American causes from neighboring towns. Robert Smith arrived flaunting confidence, surrounded by his legal and technical team. His plan was simple: present a report commissioned to experts that minimized the historical importance of the archaeological find, while emphasizing the economic benefits of his undertaking for the region. The hearing began with technical presentations from both sides. Helena presented the preliminary results of the archaeological investigations, now strengthened by the discovery of the historical documents. Robert, in turn, presented his modified project, which supposedly preserved part of the archaeological area while developing the rest of the property. When it was time for public statements, Jerry, normally reserved and averse to public exposure, surprised everyone by asking for the floor. Leaning on his wooden cane, the elderly cart driver slowly walked to the microphone installed in the center of the gymnasium. "I'm not a learned man," he began, his voice trembling but firm. "But I know how to recognize when something bigger than all of us is at stake. This land," he pointed to the ground beneath his feet, "is not just a piece of land that can be bought and sold. It's the blood and sweat of those who came before us. It's our history." A respectful silence filled the environment as the old man continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "My great-grandfather was one of the last born in that settlement of freed slaves. He told me stories that his father told him, about how that place was sacred, how it represented not just refuge, but hope. Hope that one day we would be free, to be who we are." Robert, visibly impatient, stood up to rebut, but something unexpected happened. As he headed towards the center of the gymnasium, the businessman suddenly staggered, bringing his hand to his chest with an expression of intense pain. Before anyone could react appropriately, he collapsed to the floor, victim of a sudden heart attack. The confusion was immediate. Amid screams and running, Dr. Mark, the town's only doctor, made his way through the crowd to attend to the fallen businessman. "We need to get him to the hospital immediately," he declared after a quick assessment. "He's having an acute myocardial infarction." The problem was that the nearest hospital was almost an hour away, and the local ambulance had left to transport another patient in critical condition. The state air ambulance helicopter would take at least 40 minutes to arrive, time that Robert possibly didn't have. It was in that chaotic moment that Jerry, with the calmness of those who had already faced many storms in life, made a silent gesture to his grandson Jake. The young man understood immediately, running to fetch Thunder and the cart that were tied up outside the gymnasium. "The cart is the fastest transport to the medical post at the town entrance," Jerry explained to the doctor. "Dr. Mark can stabilize him there until the ambulance arrives." The irony of the situation did not escape anyone. The man who had assaulted the horse for considering it an outdated obstacle now depended on that very animal for his survival. Carefully, Robert was placed in the cart, with the doctor beside him monitoring his vital signs. When Thunder was led to begin the rescue journey, many watched with apprehension. Would the animal refuse to transport the man who had mistreated him? To everyone's astonishment, the horse not only accepted the mission but set off at a gallop, at a speed rarely seen even in his most vigorous days, as if perfectly understanding the urgency of the situation. The journey to the medical post, normally covered in 15 minutes, was completed in just 7. This speed, combined with the first aid administered by Dr. Mark, was crucial to stabilize Robert until the arrival of the ambulance that would transport him to the regional hospital. 2 weeks passed before Robert Smith returned to Harmony Creek. The heart attack, although serious, had not been fatal thanks to the rapid intervention. However, medical recommendations were clear. He would need absolute rest for at least a month, away from the stress of business activities. Contrary to everyone's expectations, including those of his own advisors, Robert did not return to his luxurious apartment in the city. Instead, he rented a simple house near the central square of Harmony Creek. When questioned about this unusual decision, he offered a pragmatic explanation. "The fresh country air will help with my recovery." The truth, however, was more complex, and hardly admissible for a man like him. During the long nights in the hospital, while staring at the sterile ceiling of the private room, Robert had been forced to confront something he had always avoided: his own mortality. The money, power, and influence he had accumulated over decades had not prevented his heart from failing, nor would they have saved his life without the improbable intervention of an old cart driver and his mistreated horse. This realization, disturbing in itself for someone who had built his entire identity on material foundations, was amplified by a recurring dream during his hospitalization. In it, Robert saw himself lost in a labyrinth of underground tunnels pursued by indistinct shadows. The only light came from the eyes of a dappled horse that guided him through the darkness to a clearing where people of all ages danced around. A bonfire, their faces illuminated by a genuine joy he had never experienced. These dreamlike experiences, which he rationally attributed to the medication, had nevertheless planted a seed of unease in his pragmatic spirit. There was something in that small town, something beyond investment opportunities, that intrigued him deeply. His convalescence in Harmony Creek began as one might expect, isolated in his rented house, answering business calls and getting irritated with the region's unstable internet. However, as the days passed, Robert began to develop an unforeseen routine. His morning walks, initially limited to a few minutes as medically recommended, gradually extended, taking him further and further into the town center. On these incursions, he discovered Manny's Bakery, where bread was still baked in a wood-fired oven according to centuries-old recipes. He visited the small municipal museum improvised in the old train station, and, inevitably, crossed paths several times with Jerry and Thunder on their daily deliveries. The first encounters were marked by mutual embarrassment. Robert, despite his characteristic arrogance, felt uncomfortably indebted to the old cart driver. Jerry, in turn, maintained a distant politeness, showing no resentment but also not offering the warm hospitality he normally extended to everyone. It was on a Friday afternoon, when Robert was distractedly watching the square from his room window, that he noticed an unusual commotion. Residents of all ages gathered under the centuries-old mango trees, carrying musical instruments and baskets of food. Moved by genuine curiosity, he decided to investigate. "It's the folk music circle," a girl of about 10 years old timidly explained when he cautiously approached the crowd. "It happens every Friday, forever. You should stay. It's nice." Robert, who under other circumstances would have dismissed such an invitation as a waste of time, surprised himself by accepting with a hesitant nod. He positioned himself discreetly on the periphery of the circle that formed, watching with growing fascination the community ritual that unfolded. Elderly fiddlers plucked old melodies that spoke of love, work, and nature. Young people took turns on improvised percussion on cans and buckets. The children danced freely in the center of the circle. What impressed Robert most, however, was the authenticity of the interactions, the complete absence of the social masks that dominated the corporate environments he frequented. Here, paradoxically, he felt simultaneously a complete stranger and strangely at home. When night fell and improvised lanterns were lit, a surprise. Jerry, who until then had only observed silently, took a fiddle from a young man's hands and, with fingers surprisingly agile for his age, began a folk tune that spoke of the mountains surrounding the Harmony Creek Valley. His hoarse but tuned voice carried the weight of experience and a visceral connection to the land he celebrated. Robert, educated in music conservatories in his youth before abandoning art for the more lucrative promise of business, recognized something in those simple notes that transcended technique or musical theory. There was an emotional truth that unexpectedly touched him, awakening memories of a time when life seemed to offer possibilities beyond material accumulation. This was just the first of many moments of rediscovery during his forced convalescence. Gradually, Robert began to be incorporated into the daily life of the town, not as the powerful businessman who had arrived to modernize the place, but as a convalescent in search of recovery, a vulnerability that, ironically, opened doors that his money and influence could never achieve. He watched the community work day for the harvest on the small farms, where everyone worked today on a neighbor's land who would reciprocate the favor tomorrow. He attended a christening where the entire community gathered to celebrate, regardless of blood ties to the child, and more significantly, he began to regularly visit the modest stable where Thunder stayed when he was not working. These visits initially had the character of a moral obligation, a way to thank the animal that inadvertently saved his life. Robert brought carrots and apples, keeping a respectful distance while the horse, still wary, accepted the offerings cautiously. Jerry watched these encounters with an indecipherable expression, intervening only when necessary to ensure the safety of both. The decisive transformation occurred at the end of June, when unexpected news shook Harmony Creek. During a routine search in the municipal archives related to the process of recognizing the settlement of freed slaves, documents were discovered that cast serious doubts on the legitimacy of the sale of Hilltop Farm. Apparently, a significant part of the property, including precisely the area where the settlement of freed slaves was located, legally belonged to descendants of the original founders. Among them, Jerry. The revelation fell like a bombshell on Robert's plans, potentially invalidating the entire project in which he had invested millions. His lawyers immediately suggested an aggressive strategy: challenge the authenticity of the documents, drag the case out in court for years, and in the meantime proceed with construction in the uncontested areas. It was at this critical moment, when all his natural tendencies pushed him towards confrontation, that Robert Smith experienced something that could only be described as an epiphany, not in the religious sense, but as a sudden clarity about truths that had always been in front of him, obscured by the fog of ambition. During one of his now frequent morning walks, he instinctively headed towards the stable where Thunder rested. The horse, who had gradually lowered his defenses in recent weeks, approached the fence without the usual hesitation. For the first time, he allowed Robert to touch his mane, establishing a contact that seemed to transcend the barriers between species. While stroking the animal, Robert was surprised by the arrival of Helena, the archaeologist, who brought new discoveries about the settlement of freed slaves. "It's extraordinary," she commented, initially unaware of the intimacy of the moment she had interrupted. "We found evidence that this settlement of freed slaves was not just a refuge, but a center of cultural resistance. They kept alive African traditions that were systematically erased elsewhere." Robert, still absorbed in the unexpected connection with Thunder, asked a question that surprised both of them. And how could this be preserved and shared, not just as an exhibit in a museum, but as something living? The genuine tone of the question, coming from the man who until recently represented the greatest threat to that historical heritage, left Helena momentarily speechless. When she replied, there was a new respect in her voice. "With the right support, we could develop a cultural and educational center, integrated with the local community. A space where traditions could be not only studied, but practiced and passed on to new generations." This seemingly casual conversation planted a seed that would blossom in the weeks that followed. Robert, to the astonishment of his advisors and the community itself, requested a new public hearing. This time, however, not to defend his original project, but to present a completely reformulated vision. In the packed gymnasium, now without the hostile tension of the previous meeting, Robert Smith took to the stage transformed, not only by the near-death experience or the convalescence in the small town, but by a genuine reconnection with values he had abandoned in his stubborn pursuit of material success. "When I arrived in Harmony Creek," he began, with a humility rarely associated with his previous personality, "I only saw a backward place that needed to be modernized according to my vision of progress. Today I understand that true growth does not mean erasing the past, but respectfully building on its foundations." The new project he presented surprised everyone. Instead of the luxury commercial and residential complex originally planned, he proposed a sustainable and cultural tourism venture. The centerpiece would be the preserved settlement of freed slaves itself, transformed into a living museum where visitors could not only learn about African American history, but experience its cultural manifestations. The agricultural areas vital to the community would be preserved, with technical support programs for local small producers. Even more surprising was his partnership proposal. Instead of contesting the discovery about the partial ownership of Jerry and other descendants, he offered to legally transform the venture into a cooperative, where the original owners would have a significant share in the profits and decisions. "This is no longer my project imposed on your community," he concluded, looking directly at Jerry in the front row. "It's our opportunity to build something that honors the past while opening paths for the future." Robert Smith's transformation, from insensitive antagonist to respectful partner, was symbolically completed 1 year after his tempestuous arrival in town. At the new Harvest Festival, he surprised everyone by arriving not in his imported SUV, but driving a restored cart alongside Jerry. The most significant moment, however, occurred during the traditional horse parade that opened the festivities. To everyone's astonishment, it was Thunder whom Robert rode. The same animal he had mistreated a year before now accepted him as a friend. The image of the urban businessman and the work-worn horse advancing together under the golden light of the late afternoon sun perfectly captured the journey of transformation they had both traveled. This story, which unfolded over exactly 1 year in Harmony Creek, was not just about a man learning values that money cannot buy. It was about a community that, by defending its roots, found a path to grow without uprooting itself. About an animal that, in its instinctive simplicity, became a catalyst for profound human changes, and perhaps more importantly, about the ever-present possibility of redemption and new beginnings, even for those who seem least likely to change. As the sun set on that renewed Harvest Festival, with old and new songs intertwining in the air perfumed by traditional foods, the deepest lesson echoed silently. True progress is not in replacing the old with the new, but in allowing both to coexist in respectful harmony, each enriching the other with its unique wisdom. A lesson that a simple cart horse in his silent dignity had taught everyone, especially the man who once considered him too obsolete to deserve respect.